Thank you for attending our session here. The cybersecurity challenges in the age of digital infrastructure. My name is David Alexander. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And to my right here first is Peter Marks. He's the VP of Advanced Products and General Electric Digital. And then next to him is Dr. Kim Budil, the Vice President of the National Laboratories for UC Systems, excuse me. And then Dr. Chavello is the Chief Information Officer for the City of Santa Monica. And
Shall we? Okay. So my name is Peter Marks. I'm a executive at General Electric. I was a former CTO for the city of LA under Garcetti, and handling basically the city's portfolio of technology issues across the proprietaries and all the city departments. And before that, I handled R&D for a chip company called Qualcomm. Everybody in this room has a device from Qualcomm they'd be willing to bet. In fact, probably more than one, just because it's the basis for 3G, 4G, 5G, et cetera. And I'm a professor over at USC, and I look forward to talking about cybersecurity because every day there's just so much fun to be had. I'll suffice it to say that when I originally joined Qualcomm, I was of the belief that there's really no such thing as a conspiracy theory, right? Things like cybersecurity, SSL, SSH, crypto keys, all the PKI stuff, everything, hardened defenses and so on. These are remarkable technologies. They're really designed to keep us and our data and our information safe. By the time that I had left the city, after extensive work across, both the public side as well as obviously the corporate side of security, I now believe that all conspiracy theories, in fact, are true. So, and we will have a little bit fun talking. I will identify myself as an individual when I'm speaking as an individual, and as an executive when I'm speaking as an executive.
So I'm Kim Budil, and as was noted, I'm the Vice President for National Laboratories at UC. I work in the System-Wide Office of the President. The UC system is made up of 10 campuses, 5 academic medical centers, and 3 national laboratories. So Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Lawrence Livermore, and Los Alamos National Laboratories. So I have experience across a wide range of potential cybersecurity environments, and talk a little bit about how those are similar and different to each other. I'm an experimental physicist by training and by temperament. I spent a number of years working at Lawrence Livermore as a research scientist and leader, and I spent 2 stints in the government as a science advisor, most recently as an advisor on national security to the Undersecretary for Science during the first Obama administration.
Joseph Civitello. I've been with the City of Santa Monica now for about 15 months as the Chief Information Officer. And we have technology in just about everything you can imagine, and every day we add more. Previous to being with the city, I had a career in higher education, long career in higher education, both at institutions here in California and on the East Coast, and internationally. And actually my biggest cybersecurity challenge was a university that I helped set up in Saudi Arabia called King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which is really the first mixed gender university, private university in the Middle East where the laws of Saudi don't apply. So it's been there for 7 years. It's its own little enclave, guarded by 450 National Guard troops, as much to keep people within the university as to keep people from the university. And so quite an interesting information security challenge there. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you very much. So I know traditionally people think of cybersecurity as a set of firewalls, a set of rules. You want to employ technology. We've got vendors who want to sell us product. And while that element of cybersecurity is very important to us, what we really need to focus on is more approaching this from the people than the processes, and then looking at technology perspective. People are definitely the primary drivers for business. They are what enable us to produce our product, whatever that is in the public or private sector. They're also the biggest impact on cybersecurity. They are our biggest risk in cybersecurity in almost every aspect of what they do. Cybersecurity is driven from here, and you have to start from here in order to really create a foundationally effective cybersecurity program. Following that, it would be your processes. You want to assist people in ensuring that your business processes are resilient, that they'll last, that they're repeatable. And so the processes themselves really do support your business from the perspective of being able to produce that product, whatever that product might be. They're also the driving force for the business itself. Cybersecurity needs to be baked into those processes. It needs to be designed and built into those processes from the beginning. Relatively speaking, it's cheapest to do it that way. Sometimes people will find challenges in doing that or considering that, but the fact is that's where you want to start. And then once you've established your people and you've established your processes to be foundationally cyberly secure, that's not a word, I know, what you want to do then is then focus on the technologies. And in this case, technologies for cybersecurity would be focusing on validation, audit, control, compliance, those types of things to the business processes and the requirements that you've given your people in the form of policy. So that it allows you to audit and monitor. But it's definitely not the source of cybersecurity in general. That being said, what I'd like to do is ask a question of the panel, and the first one here would be, how would the environment and population impact your cybersecurity approach?
So why don't I take I'll take a real slant at that, and we'll expand the definition of cybersecurity to include, well, security of our cyber infrastructure, of our information infrastructure. And we're sitting in LA. So LA, in fact, this could be said for anywhere in California. Los Angeles, I think the federal government defines something like 13 types of natural disasters, and California is subject to 11 of them. And we're not including anything defined as being digital natural disaster. But in the case of resiliency, our information, systems are critically important. I mean, it sort of goes without saying, right? But I'd be willing to bet that in earthquake preparedness training that everybody here has always had, nobody has ever mentioned your cell phone as being one of those absolutely critical things. And of course, behind it is the cellular infrastructure. And then on top of it are things like, for example, the systems that manage water, electricity, the transportation system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in the cases of floods, fires, earthquakes, you name it. And so if you take a look at cybersecurity, we've actually had two really interesting things happen in the last month, hitting that digital infrastructure in the case of disasters, environments, that it sort of sparked my interest. One was, of course, the floods up in the Santa Barbara area, where the notifications that people received were either too late or not received correctly, or there wasn't a way of getting them, and there was a lot of confusion and a number of newspaper articles about it. And then, of course, the other cybersecurity event was Hawaii was briefly under a nuclear attack. I think those are topics that are really well outside of the normal cybersecurity discussions, but they really, impact, if you will, environments and populations in sort of interesting ways. And it's probably not exactly what you were asking for, but I think it's one of those things that sort of we have to begin to deal with, because the issue of cybersecurity is really expanding.
Right.
So I think it's important to note that when you're thinking about cybersecurity, all the solutions are local. So we just underwent a very large-scale system-wide effort within the University of California on cybersecurity. So as I said, we have 5 medical centers and 10 campuses, and we've had a number of high-profile data breaches, particularly in the medical enterprise, and there are particular concerns about protecting patient data and information. In addition, we have a huge amount of personal information about students, another very sensitive population. And then you have a system that's built on the idea of open exchange of information, and a community, a very outspoken community in the faculty that really doesn't want to see infringements made upon that. And then in my enterprise at the National Laboratories, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory is a very open environment. They run the National Energy Research Supercomputing Center, which provides computing capacity to about 6,000 users from around the world on a yearly basis. So they prize, again, the openness and accessibility of their networks. At Lawrence Livermore in Los Alamos, where they do secure work, they have a series of nested networks, targeted at the different types of information that they hold. So the importance of thinking about not just the information you're trying to protect, but the people who are managing and handling that information, and tailoring your system, your defenses, your approach to cybersecurity to the specifics of your environment, I think is a critically important component of that. And so when we thought about cybersecurity for the UC system as an example, we didn't adopt a series of policies and procedures and things, thou shalts, although inevitably those types of things flow from it. We adopted a framework so that you could have some level of consistency and approach, and develop some confidence that everybody was at least thinking about the problem with the right level of fidelity.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
So this morning I read something that Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, said at Davos, which I think is very passing to this conversation. And that is, he said, the pace of change has never been this fast, and yet it will never be this slow again. And when I think about technology, I think that the amount of technology that we're adopting and that's embedded throughout our lives, many people call this the fourth industrial revolution, the idea of ubiquitous, embedded, autonomous technology that creates immense amounts of data, and that are also embedded in physical things, the Internet of Things. I think that's the big challenge for us in cybersecurity, because all of those devices generate data which can be used for good or ill. And the challenge is not around the technology. I have a lot of faith that we'll be able to come up with technical countermeasures for many of these things. For me, the challenge is around behavior and culture. And I don't think our behavior and our culture is catching up quickly enough to the rate of adoption of the technologies. And one of the things that comes to mind from our last election is it's still incredibly unbelievable to me that the campaign manager for a major party could send emails to staff with sensitive information, and it would never occur to him that that was all imminently and inherently discoverable and could be exploited. I mean, it's just absolutely unfathomable that a man that smart could miss it. And I think we're missing a lot of the things like that because of the technologies we're used to using.
There's a more prosaic sort of fun example actually right now. So how many people here run or bicycle for exercise? Anybody? So anybody here use an app called Strava?
I was about to download it, but I think I'll wait now.
Oh, no. So Strava was started by a friend of mine. He used to work at Apple, and he was an avid bicyclist. And he did an app for bicyclists to basically track and share what they do. And it's used across the world. And so the other day they published a map of all of the data that they've received. No personal information, just a map of all the activities of all the runners and the bicyclists around the world. And of course, that includes folks in the military who agreed to the EULA and the terms of service on the app. But to go from an app which is really for exercise to now an app that is revealing the patterns and usage at secret military bases around the world, to whom, by the way, the military is not, the military didn't click on anything to agree to use Strava. But it's a really interesting issue, right? Because as an individual, they're certainly not thinking of cybersecurity when they're going out for a run. And so it's really a fascinating issue. And frankly, I don't know how one comes across that, because compute, devices, digital are just everywhere. They're 100% everywhere.
One of the challenges we have to face at Water and Power with our engagement with NERC and SIP compliance and so on and so forth, those drivers, is that inference of data. And that's actually one of the areas that we're really looking into deeply in the utility sectors, is that inference of data as much as the direct data. And we're now being challenged to engage in from a compliance perspective, that inference of data. And that makes it much more challenging for us, because we have to kind of guess where we have to be rather than actually say, this is what we have to defend. It's an indefensible edge now.
So I just want to comment on the Strava example, because I was
Yeah.
reading about that. I mean, if you think about the explosion of data, how much information is really available about, for example, just to choose this random example, military operations around the world with publicly available imaging satellite data and things like that. You know, as was mentioned, the technology is so quickly outpacing our ability to deal with the information or even understand the implications of it.
Right.
So, you know, the movements on those military bases may have already been pretty well known by people who cared.
Absolutely.
But it's an interesting example of just how much you can learn from things that we never even considered the implications of.
I think the tension is that the world is getting more transparent.
Right.
You know, we did a lot of work on open data. In fact, David and I worked very closely together on open data for the city.
Right.
And that's a transparent government. We probably all didn't sign up for individual transparency, yet that's kind of where we're going. And at the same time, we want to have some sort of security, which actually implies opacity. And so it's a
Right.
really interesting tension.
Yep.
So,
Well, it's the same thing with networks.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity is no longer about protecting the perimeter of your network. Your network's been penetrated. I mean, you can pretty well assume that.
yeah.
It's a question of understanding who's on your network and what
Right.
they might be doing.
Right. So I really have to state that, you know, consumerism drives innovation, and that's fair. We just need cyber, I think, to engage that same innovation.
Yeah.
Speaking of compliance, DWP, of course, is drowning in compliance. So we have many different avenues of compliance that we have to meet, and that's fair. As an organization that meets with the public, interacts with the public, provides a public service, we have to be compliant to the different rules and regulations associated to public care. That being said, is compliance really an effective driver for cybersecurity?
Speaking as an individual, I think intuitively no. You know, how many people here read every EULA in terms of service for every app and website that you go to?
Not.
Come on, everybody raise your
Come on.
hands.
Okay. Anybody here ever read all of the federal regulations on? Okay. Come on, guys. This is a professional audience. I rest my case.
Next, finished.
I think for me, the counterpart of compliance has to be risk. And I think when we talk about security and we talk about it disconnected from the idea of risk, I think that's where we run into challenges. So, you know, being from a city, we have a fire department and we have a police department. And yet, we still have fires and we still have crime. And when that happens, people don't get energized or enervated about it and say, oh my God, we've had a fire in this city. How could we have a fire in this city? It's a risk. We know it. We spend a lot of money trying to mitigate it. But it doesn't stop fires or crime. It's the same thing with cybersecurity. I think the idea that we have to look at the risks, and as Kim said, we know that people have hacked our network. The question is, what's the risk inherent in that?
And what's the mitigation?
And what's the mitigation strategy for it?
I think for compliance is an important component, but it's a relatively small component. And if you focus on it, you become complacent.
Right.
You know, forms and procedures and documentation don't actually protect networks. They don't. And they don't actually change people's behaviors. So if folks feel like reading the cybersecurity training and signing on the dotted line is adequate for them to understand the risk that they're attendant with, and they're not thinking, when an email comes into your inbox, do you look at it with a critical eye and say, does this really look like something I should be responding to or interacting with?
I think there's a real argument for community and social pressure and a atmosphere, if you will, of how can I put it, of reporting. So I use an example, which is that we all know that Uber, for example, was hacked, and they paid their hackers $100,000 to go away, and then they reported it to, well, in fact, they actually never quite reported it. And so they never officially reported it. And so, of course, that Anybody, I apologize to anybody who's an investor or works at Uber, but that's the poster child for how not to do it, right? It's always the cover-up in this case. Now, by comparison, given the fact that we've all been hacked, we've all been penetrated, all of our data, is at risk, if you will, then it's incumbent upon ourselves to be able to report it and then to mitigate the damage that comes from the fact that we've been hacked or penetrated. And that's really the key thing. It's an organizational, community, social issue, I think, more than anything else.
Right. You have to change the incentives. I mean, if the incentive is that you'll be publicly vilified and your stock will lose value, then the likelihood you'll report next time is going to be low.
Yeah,
Sure. So though compliance can't drive in secure environments, it can actually help to identify risk. And that can be a mechanism in your infrastructure and your environment to help you identify the risk and make it more of a cultural approach rather than a reactive approach. That being said, I think some of the drivers around what we are dealing with can be driven to the obvious thing here, the Internet of Things. So that's the big one here for us, is everyone wants to connect, everyone wants the technology, everyone wants to consume. And this is even happening within businesses, within organizations of formal, where formal business processes would be in place. People want to bring in the new technology. Strava, thank you, is a good example of that. That said, how do you think the Internet of Things is going to continue to impact cybersecurity moving forward?
So, when I was at Qualcomm, so the Internet of Things was originally something called machine-to-machine, a term that just by definition, as soon as you're finished saying, you've gone to sleep. And so the marketing folks came up with a new term called IoT, Internet of Things. And then a friend of mine started a group inside of Qualcomm called the Internet of Everything. And to which people reacted and said, well, if you're running the Internet of Everything, is there anything left over for any of us? But anyway, bad joke. But the point being is that virtually everything is now being connected to the net on some level. If you think about the cellular communications networks, for example, 2G was about getting people to talk to each other. 3G was about text messages and SMS. 4G was about apps and web services. Well, 5G, which is beginning to roll out, we're now beginning to see trials on 5G, is going to be about connecting up the world's machines, full stop. And to that end, you can imagine the cybersecurity issues when the doors over there are connected to the net. In this building, in this room right here, there's a lot of different safety systems and systems that are kind of all independent, right? The lighting, the HVAC, the fire suppression, all the rest of it. Well, in the future, of course, in vision, those things are all going to be connected. And that, of course, leads to a lot of interesting problems that we could have just literally just thinking about where we're sitting right now with, things like penetration, data, security. So.
To your point, I think or to David's point from earlier, I think your example of having all the safety systems on a single network, when you think through the compliance aspect of that might tell you that maybe that's not a good idea, and that defense in depth suggests that you should have some independence across your networks, but I agree, the problem is coming. What I think is interesting about the Internet of Things, this is just a personal opinion, is that right now it feels like a huge, not very thoughtful technology push of things for which ultimately I don't see any benefit being connected to each other. I was talking with someone earlier about going to buy a new refrigerator and all of the technology that was built into these refrigerators. I just couldn't help thinking that the security risk was so much bigger in my mind than the opportunity to have the refrigerator write a grocery list for me that I couldn't understand.
Well, but sorry, Joseph, just for a half second, but we're actually surrounded by a lot of quote unquote Internet of Things right now. All the streetlights in LA, for example, are mesh networked. They're LED. They're individually controllable, et cetera. All the stoplights are connected to a single transportation, computer. Really, just a few blocks from here. There are 4,500 intersections, 45,000 lights, 23,000 loop detectors. And so on and so forth. The parking meters in downtown and Hollywood and Westwood and so on are all connected to the net. And so there's a lot of IoT stuff that's out there right now, and we're beginning to see, obviously all those things were designed with security in mind. But if you take the assumption that, for example, we have in fact been penetrated and hacked and so on, those systems are not necessarily built for mitigation yet. So, sorry.
Yes, sir. Kim, I'm glad you brought up refrigerators, because I was thinking about the same thing. And really my point is really about behavior and culture. So I was thinking back to my time in graduate school when I was in a Sloan management class, and we were talking about, before anybody had the term, Internet of Things. And this was 1998. And it was a bunch of very smart Harvard and MIT students in a room, and we broke down into groups. And we thought about connecting everything that you could imagine, toasters, refrigerators, everything else. And this is 1998, and everybody said, this stuff's all going to be connected within 5 years. Of course, it was pre-dot-com bubble burst. But what struck me about that conversation is at no point did anybody talk about the security or think that anything bad could be done with that technology. And it strikes me that we're in very much the same place in 2017. I don't think behaviorally or culturally we've caught up with that. And the other thing that I think is important to understand about the Internet of Things, and I'm not against it by any means, but it brings to mind a quote from Marshall McLuhan, which is, technologies are put out before they're thought out. And I think that's always the key with innovation. I mean, people don't think of the ramifications of putting a technology out, such as Strata. I'm sure nobody thought that that could be used as a possible security hole for the military. But that's the reality of where we are. And I think that's always going to happen. How we control our technology, how we understand it, and how we mitigate our behavior is a whole different ballgame, and that's something we can control.
Well, there's a tension between innovation and, if you will, fear, right? So we would never do anything new, because doing something new is always by definition risky, right? However, that said, there's a lot of new things out there that, are sort of fun. How many people here have an Alexa or Google Home? Okay. You guys think about security? Just curious.
It's always listening.
Solidly secured and
Yeah.
constantly tested.
It's a speaker that's always listening to you.
Yeah.
Now, if you've gone back 10 or 20 or 30 years, try to describe to your mom why you need a speaker that listens to you.
Well, it is interesting, and I have to catch myself in moments like this. I've spent my whole life in and around the national security community,
Right.
so I'm a natively suspicious person. But we do have an Alexa in our house.
But it's at home.
But it's a calculated risk, right? The Alexa can return benefit. I can say, play NPR, and magically it comes on.
Right.
And anybody who really wants to know what I'm talking about in my house is welcome to it. I mean, sort of the downside doesn't seem very high.
Yeah.
Whereas as it becomes more and more pervasive and more parts of your life are connected to it, you have less and less control, and people become immune to the instinct to even think about it.
Right.
That's when it becomes very worrisome to me.
So I spent most of October in China, and I spent a lot of time in China over the years, but in October I was in Western China. Anybody here ever been to Kashgar or Urumqi or cities like that? So it's fascinating. It's not a well-traveled place. It's way down the Silk Road and all the rest of it. But as an example, IoT is being used by the government for public safety in a big, big way. And we won't go too far into that right now. But I will say, for example, when you go into a cafe or restaurant in Kashgar, just like in the U.S., there's a security camera sort of watching over the space. The difference being is that security camera is provided by the government. So, and so it's just food for thought. Security is a really fascinating IoT space. So.
Well, it's just like your point about the networks that already exist in the city.
Right.
There's tremendous public benefit to that, both in energy consumption and efficiency of traffic and all those sorts of things, and substantial potential vulnerabilities that can be associated with that.
Sure. So As a final thought, what would you recommend as a single takeaway for cyber and the digital infrastructure going forward?
A single takeaway.
So I would argue that, these are all professionals who think about cybersecurity every day. And I don't know where you all work and what you do for a profession, but I would argue that, in fact, actually cybersecurity has become part of everybody's DNA. As an individual, as a professional, as a student, as a patient, everything. The protection and management of one's data and environment, and increasingly, things like security are really interlinked. They're really intertwined. So, and part of that is that even something as simple as like losing a USB key, or I'm sure all of us have little thumb drives and so on. You get drawers of these things. But do you ever think about the fact that if you've lost it, you lost track of it? Maybe it has your employer's data. Maybe it has your health record and things like that. And so these are thoughts that are really new to a lot of folks, but I think that increasingly we really have to start to grapple with this. So.
I think it's really important for people to develop a little bit of this instinct that I have natively, which is to do the risk-benefit calculus for yourself as you add complexity to your life, to your technology environment, or it's added to your technology environment for you. When you think about how complicated and how wired the world is becoming, and it doesn't mean you want to push it away or you don't want to participate in it, but you should be aware of it, and you should understand how much information footprint you're leaving in the world, and try to make conscious choices on that front. I've tried to train my kids to have a little bit of this instinct that it is not necessary that every single thing you do be publicly broadcast, so that you have some opportunity at least to control the footprint that you leave in cyberspace. And again, in your home, in your car, in your work environment, to be conscious of what you're surrounded with at a minimum, so that, if Alexa is listening, you can at least judge whether or not you want to go to the next room to talk or not.
Well, I have to throw in, you have to wonder what that lone bicyclist who was riding around the perimeter of Area 51 is thinking today.
Exactly. That could all be a government
At
ruse. You don't know.
At 16.2 miles an hour.
Exactly.
Building on the idea of risk, I also wonder how this is going to affect the idea of insurance. So look, it's not a question of if, it's when. You're going to get hacked, I'm going to get hacked, cities are going to get hacked, any organization. And insurance until now has been based on risk pools. But when we now have technology, for instance, with respect to car insurance, where we could put a sensor in everybody's car, and we could know how good or bad of a driver you are. Everybody thinks they're a great driver, by the way, I know. And the amount of insurance you pay is based upon your actual driving. How does that affect our idea of insurance? And I think the same thing will probably have to mature in these worlds that we're involved in as far as cybersecurity, because I think there are ways to assess the risks, to assess behavior, but the amount of money that will be offered up in breaches and the amount of money that will be needed to insure against breaches is going to be phenomenal in the coming years, and it's something we really need to get a handle on in this world.
One of the rules that I live by in my organization is trust but verify. And so for me, that's one of my big takeaways, just going forward in general in cyber. That being said, I'd like to turn to the audience to see if there are any questions. Yes?
As we progress towards the idea of a smart city and that in itself becoming more complex, how do we manage the overlapping of networks between the developer-owned multi-building smart networks that they have and how they link in with the city? How do you see that playing out in the long term?
There's an example, actually in New York, which is that the NYPD, for example, has done agreements with a number of private real estate owners to go and say, let me have access to your cameras, just as a really simple example. And the challenge is always that, you know, there's a public good, a private good, a corporate good, an institutional good, and all the rest of it. And I'm going to take a really holistic view on cities. But we wrote a report on the future of cities for the Obama administration. And we really grappled with, you know, where does security and cyber and everything else fit? But the fact of the matter is that cities are really just collections of people, right? They're just platforms for people to feel safe, to raise their families, to get jobs, to, you know, get healthcare and everything else. That urban density is because people want to be near people. And so it's much less about, let's say, government versus corporations versus institutions versus individuals. It really is upon this collective idea of the common good. And I think that we all sort of realize is that there's less need for transparency, for example, inside of people's homes. But on the other hand, as soon as you walk out of that home onto the public street, there's a real need for, if you will, for public safety. So that's a crunchy answer, but I think that that's kind of where people go. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, come on.
Come on. Cyber.
I wanted to comment earlier, you mentioned Chrome, I think you mentioned Chrome here, and Google, and I think that, I mean,
Yeah.
Chrome, you know, is kind of
Yeah.
Google.
I didn't mention it. Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of us are much used to that system as a, you know, as an email server, and I know that in a lot of bigger systems like versus say DWP, I know the mayor's office made the switch to a Google server as their email server. Talk about what are the advantages of doing that and having a much more, I guess, I want to call it modern, but I don't know if it's compared to other, you know, like Microsoft or Outlook or so. Talk about what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of having such program? Because I feel like the perception is that Google Chrome as an email server or just as a searching engine is more risky than per se, you know, others. So can you talk about what, in terms of risk, how risky this is for an entity like DWP? I'm sorry, I'm Aura Vasquez. I am a commissioner with DWP. Okay. And also, and how, because we interact a lot with our customers via email. And our vendors, and they email us things, and we email them back. You know, so, and I know that hackers love this stuff because it's like a great point entry for them to kind of get in the system and do all the fun stuff that they like to do. So I wonder, what's your take on these like different like servers and what versus one or the other, or maybe which one offers more advantages to today's technology?
Should I take a quick stab and then
Sure,
you want to?
sure.
Okay, so you're asking, so the city took a decision for a number of years ago to move generally over onto Google Enterprise for email, calendaring, and so on. And part of the reason was economic, and part of the reason was because if you think about things like email is about communications, right? So being able to easily communicate across a myriad number of silos and departments and people and constituencies, you know, email works best if you have high degrees of interoperability. The problem is that, of course, email is also used for secure communications. Email is used for, you know, people talking about patients or, you know, energy systems and all that sort of stuff.
Or billing questions.
Or billing questions,
Yeah.
paychecks. You know,
Exactly.
we use email for everything, right? And so there's this tension, if you will. And so the city moved, for many of its departments, moved onto the cloud, saved a ton of money. And by the way, there's an argument to be made that if Google, for example, gets hacked on its email, well, it has roughly 1 billion users, you know. So the reputation damage for Google being hacked is really, really high. Now, the other side of the school of thought is to go and say, well, let's run, you know, our email just ourselves, right, inside of on-premise, if you will. Well, there is a disadvantage to that, which is that, you know, quite frankly, now you have the expense and responsibility for taking care of all that. And there's this will sound terrible, but much of the infrastructure in the world has never been updated, right? Just, it takes too long, people don't do it, they don't get paid to do it, et cetera. And so there's a security issue for both on-premise, and then there's a security issue for the cloud. And you really have to make a decision. Oftentimes, there's a regulatory side. You know, for example, I would doubt that DWP is allowed to host its critical infrastructure on a third-party vendor in the cloud across the publicly available internet. But on the other hand, for general communications, why not? So, and I'm sure you have some wild thoughts on that.
If the question is which is inherently more secure, the cloud or on premises, I don't think that's a question that can truly be answered, because you can have a very secure cloud environment or you can have an insecure one. I can tell you I have a lot more faith in Google or Microsoft as an email provider than I do in my own staff. And there's a very good reason for that. Not because I don't have good staff, and if they were here, they'd laugh. But I have great staff. It's a simple fact that I don't have as many security people, and I don't have as many countermeasures as those companies do. Because of what Peter pointed out, if they get hacked, their business is gone. But this reminds me of something which I heard for many years in higher education, which was the debate about online education is inherently more democratic than face-to-face education. It's inherently more this or that. And all those arguments are just plain untrue, because you can have terrible face-to-face teaching, undemocratic, lecture-based, and you can have the same thing online. It depends on what the posture is, and in this case, the security posture of that particular environment.
So from a cybersecurity perspective, you have to look at the data itself, not the system.
Yeah.
And once you've classified how important that data is for you, you can establish like a list of controls or a list of rules that you want around that data. And then wherever you decide to store it, whether it's in-house or in the cloud or wherever, if they can genuinely meet those controls that you require, then that's the direction you typically would want to go. Cloud offers the cost economy. In-house basically offers the ability for you to say, I have it in-house.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, ultimately you have to protect the data with the levels of control that you need to protect the data, regardless of where it resides.
I mean, for example, the LAPD, we moved the LAPD, they did not move onto Google when that decision was made. And they were stuck, in fact, actually on a very antiquated system for a long time. Financial, et cetera. They recently moved over to cloud-based hosting from Microsoft for their email. And part of the reason for that was because Microsoft is what is called CJIS compliant, which is an information standard for justice systems. And that made a decision that allowed them to go and get the benefit of being on the cloud, but within that regulatory framework.
Right.
As an example.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alicia Ramos with Hatch, and my question is, I come from the water space, and here with AWP and the city. Recently, there's a lot of interest in terms of these green infrastructure projects, projects that capture runoff, store runoff, trying to kind of use digital infrastructure, being able to track, what is the volume that's captured, or, how what is treated. So one of the questions I have is, there's a need for secure communication, there's a need for reliable communications, there's a need, and the reason why I say reliable is these projects are response to certain requirements, water quality requirement, or capture requirement. And there's a need also to maintain transparency, because, you're going back to the public and say, here's a water pond, these are the projects that we have, for example, problem, $500 million project. So there's a level of transparency that is needed, and then, so this is kind of an evolving field, that you're trying to get green infrastructure projects, connect them, being able to operate them remotely. And so can you share with us a little bit in terms of, some of the challenges and opportunities, as you're trying to progress through this and being able to hook them up and present information in a secure, reliable, transparent.
That's complicated. So what you have to end up doing is you have to end up looking at it from the resource perspective. Where is the data originating? Where does the data need to go? And look at it less from the network and the hardware itself. So it would be up to the vendors, the providers, to be able to design and architect solutions that would take into account where the data is and where it needs to go and what forms of that data need to communicate. And they would be the ones to describe and define the protocols or the methods of communication that would be required to make sure that the data stays secure. I would also be concerned about whether or not the data itself has the integrity level that you need, right? The accuracy, especially if you're addressing transparency. So as these systems are rolled out, the architecture around that would have to center around assuring the confidentiality if needed, and then the integrity of the environment as needed as well. But those would be the two focal points that I would be focusing as far as what you would have as a solution. There aren't that many standards out there other than the basic communications standards themselves. And so as this is an evolving field, we're going to have to kind of step back and wait to see how it gets architected. But it's definitely going to be centered around the protocols of communication themselves as the principal responsibility of making sure that this happens for you.
And by the way, these issues show up in different ways in different parts of the world. You know, for example, I did a lot of work, like Joseph did, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is currently digitizing its water system, as an example. It's a really interesting tension, if you will, because 60% of their water is delivered by pipe, the other 40% by truck. And so that data has never really been available before. And when the data is available, it's going to cause cultural change in ways that nobody can anticipate. So.
We can speak a little more later, but I think we're out of time now, and I'd like to thank the panel for joining and participating in this event. Thank you.
Thank you.